record as well. Hello everyone arriving in. We have some wonderful people coming in right now. I'm just making sure that everything is ready to go. Everyone's coming in, wonderful. So, welcome back to another week of Reasonings with Jane. It has been a little bit of a break. We had a brief hiatus last week, but we're back and raring and reasonable. But before we begin, I would, of course, as always, like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all meeting here this evening. I, myself, am on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Orderered Nation. Jane's coming to us from the land of the Camaragal people, and our special guest this evening, Kerryn Phelps, is on Dharawal land. And I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend a particularly warm welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. And of course acknowledge that wherever we are all coming in from, all over Australia on Zoom tonight, we are all on First Nations land, and sovereignty was never ceded. So, welcome back. Yes, welcome back after a little break. I hope you all had a wonderful long weekend. My name is Hannah, and I am here once again to be hosting the Q&A at the end of the webinar this evening. This is also the first evening that we will be live streaming out to other platforms. So we're live on Facebook and YouTube at the same time as well. So welcome to everyone who is not on Zoom joining us from elsewhere. Our host this evening, as always, is Reason Australia's lead candidate for the Senate in New South Wales. She is the ever vibrant Jane Caro. Welcome back, Jane.
I like how you come up with a different adjective every time. I'm now getting quite excited to hear what the next one will be. Thank you, Hannah. Hannah, of course, is the number 2 on the Reason ticket for the Senate.
And of course, joining Jane tonight is Professor Kerryn Phelps. Kerryn is the former president of the AMA. She's a social commentator, and she shook Australia when she won the seat of Wentworth, a traditional Liberal stronghold at the 2018 by-election as an independent. Kerryn is going to be a wonderful guest to have this evening because there's been so much buzz around independent candidates in this upcoming federal election. So tonight, Kerryn and Jane will be having a chat about the potential role of independence in improving the health of Australian politics. And of course, at the end of the discussion, we'll be having a Q&A session. If you have questions to ask, you can pop them into the Q&A section. There is a chat section as well if you want to have a chat amongst yourselves, but if you have questions, pop them in the Q&A section, and I will come to them at the end. But until then, please sit back and enjoy. And I'll hand it over to you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I'm delighted that we have Kerryn Phelps with us this evening. Who could be better to talk about the health of our democracy than an actual medico and someone who put her money where her mouth was and stood as an independent and won. She's a kind of, maybe she's the mother of the movement that's happening now, which is wonderful. So I want to get straight to it, Kerryn. What's your take on the campaign so far? Okay, it's early days, we're only in the second week, but nevertheless, what's your take? What do you think about the tone, the content, how the media are behaving? What's your observation?
Well, Jane, I'd argue that we're not in the second week of the campaign. I think we're in about the 6th month because it has been going on and on and on. And I have been wondering who is actually running the country, while most of our senior politicians have been running around the country to various locations, and in particular a certain Prime Minister who seems to have been putting on fancy dress all over the country and pretending to be all sorts of different skilled workers around the place. And meanwhile, we've had some really major challenges facing this country. So in terms of the so-called official campaign, which has really been the last week or so, there's been a lot of focus placed on the 2 leaders. What I've noticed that's changed over the last few days is that there is now an increasing focus on the teams behind those leaders, and that there is also a much greater focus. It's almost like a sudden awareness of the real potential for the independents in this upcoming election. We saw, of course, between the 2018 by-election and the 2019 election, the power of a strong, sensible, centrist crossbench in what could be achieved. And I think that that's an example for what we could be seeing in the next parliament after the May 21 election. So in terms of the tone, I think there's been, a bit of immaturity in the way things have been reported. I think that there have been, focuses on gotcha moments. I think that there's been probably inadequate attention paid to the record of the incumbent government and what they might plan for the future. I don't think there's been quite enough attention paid to the broken promises from the last election. And I think what everybody really wants to see is an optimistic vision, an achievable vision for the future of our country that leaves nobody behind.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it's interesting, the independents do seem to be becoming more of the story of this election, which obviously I'm standing for the Senate, so it's a different thing. You have to be a small party to be above the line. But nevertheless, I feel like, we're so small, we practically qualify, that this idea of having a sensible, reasonable crossbench, both in the lower house and in the Senate, is incredibly important, because as you would know, having worked in the parliament, that if we get a progressive House of Representatives, and I certainly hope we do, if we get a reactionary Senate, nothing will change.
Well, this is why it's so important that every Australian voter considers their role in being able to install the next government, and a government that reflects their vision for the future of Australia. And this is why these community independents that have arisen all over the country, and include Jane, your candidacy for the New South Wales Senate, and Kim Rubenstein in the ACT Senate. That if we have a strong group of those centrist, independent, community-based representatives in both the House of Representatives and in the Senate, then I think we've got a real opportunity to change the whole face of Australian politics for the better, that we can get better legislation, that we can vote down legislation that's not in the national interest and not in the interest of Australians. And so I think it's a very interesting time we have ahead. And I think people who are going to be electing the next government in whatever form it takes have a really great opportunity this time to make a difference in a way that they perhaps didn't think that they would have that opportunity to do.
And it is striking, and I'm sure you've noticed it as much as me, how many of the community-based independents are women. And also I was reading today Peter Lewis's article about the gender voting gap, that in fact Morrison is much better at winning male votes than female ones.
What a shock.
Yeah. I don't think a woman in Australia thinks that's peculiar.
Well, Jane, you cast your mind back to March of last year with the March for Justice, and I was on the Parliament House lawns on that day with the march, and what an inspiring moment in Australian history, where we saw these incredible speakers, including Brittany Higgins, standing up in front of thousands and thousands of women, and women gathering all over Australia to express their frustration and their anger at the lack of equality, justice, and respect for women, at the apparent blind spot that politics has had for the really important issues that affect women disproportionately to men. And of course, there are issues like childcare, aged care, healthcare, where women are disproportionately affected by policies that are enacted by governments. And for women to stand up and talk about things like safety in their workplace, including in Parliament House, it was a watershed moment for Australian women in Australian politics. And I think when also women, you talked about the independents largely being women, when you look at what happened in 2018 in that by-election, I think women around the country looked at that result and Cathy McGowan's win in 2013 and then Zali Steggall's win in 2019 and said, you know what, I don't have to wait around to see if it's, you know, a party that doesn't necessarily promote women of merit will one day choose me to represent them. You know, women who are deeply embedded in their electorates, in their communities, who've worked in voluntary capacities, who are themselves highly accomplished and highly skilled, for them to say, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and I can do this, and to have community groups getting behind those women is really a phenomenon that we really haven't ever seen before. And I don't think it's any coincidence that it's almost all women who are standing up in these roles.
And also, they, as you mentioned, they've had role models to show them how to do it. Cathy McGowan, obviously, in Indi originally, then Helen Haynes, and you, of course, in Wentworth, also, and Zali Steggall after you. You got up there and did it. And basically, what's that line we heard when we were young feminists? You can't be what you can't see. Well, you know, we saw, and it's obviously had a huge effect. So tell us what it was like being the member for Wentworth, for, you know, actually taking that seat from the Liberal Party, which after all have held it for so long. And again, you're a role model now for the Allegra Spender campaign, because I think without you having done it once, people would be much less able to believe that it could happen a second time.
Well, it's made it possible, I think, in people's minds. I think there was always the potential there. We just didn't realise that it was there, and that there is no longer any seat that can be considered safe forever for any major political party or for any individual for that matter. And I think that what it means is that all of the members of the House are really going to have to lift their game and make sure that they represent their communities, and that their communities will be watching to see how they vote on issues of importance like climate action, like integrity in politics, an integrity commission, equality and fairness, how they vote on issues that are fundamentally important to the people in those electorates. Mm-hmm. And so that's another reason why I think that there's been so much a greater interest in the independents. But when you say, what was that like? Look, I considered it an enormous privilege, an enormous responsibility. And I was just tremendously grateful for the opportunity that I was given by the people of Wentworth to represent them, even though it was for not as long as I would like it to have been, but to have been able to raise these sorts of issues in the Parliament, and to speak about in my first speech in Parliament, to talk about the human experience that should really underpin every piece of legislation that is considered by the House of Representatives and the Senate. That legislation should be about how the workings of government impact on people as they live their lives. And if we put that human experience test to all pieces of legislation, then I think that we're going to get better legislation, and legislation that is in the interest of Australians.
Well, you were in the House for a shorter time than I would have liked as well, actually, Kerryn. But you were instrumental in getting that very important Medivac legislation through. So it's not like you didn't achieve something. You achieved something really important that did exactly what you were just talking about. It actually impacted vulnerable people's lives directly and made them better. Tell us what it was like getting that legislation through.
Well, one of the important issues that came up during the campaign for the 2018 by-election in Wentworth was the issue of getting kids off Nauru. And the hashtag Kids Off Nauru campaign started in around August of 2018. So when the election campaign rolled around in October, sort of late September, October, that was a very hot button issue. And so it became something that the community in Wentworth was very interested in progressing. And so when I went into Parliament, I had meetings and I had meetings in terms of developing policy, as you're doing at the moment, speaking to people who are experts in their field. And one of those areas that I was talking to people about was refugee policy and the issues around indefinite offshore detention as opposed to offshore processing. And what became evident was that there were people who were locked on Manus Island and Nauru with no plan for their future. And when they developed a health crisis, they were being blocked by bureaucratic obstacles from coming to Australia for the healthcare that they needed. And so I sat down with the advocates and I said to them, if we can get one piece of legislation in before the next election, we didn't know how long we would have till the next election, what would be the most impactful thing that we could do that would make the biggest difference? And they said to me, if we can change this issue around the medical evacuation of people who have a medical crisis and are being blocked from coming to Australia. And we heard, for example, I mean, this is obviously quite a long and involved story, but we heard from people who'd been working on Nauru, for example, about children who had developed this withdrawal syndrome where they lost the will to live. Oh. So we needed to find a way of getting those children and older people who were trapped in these terrible circumstances in a humanitarian crisis to Australia. So to cut a long story short, we formulated this legislation with legal advice, with advice from advocates, with advice from people like Behrouz Bajani and from people who had firsthand human experience of Australia's policy. And we set about formulating this legislation. And we had to negotiate the details of the legislation to make sure that we satisfied national security principles and all of those things. And we worked with the ALP, we worked with the Greens, we worked with the crossbench, and we came up with this superb piece of legislation which did exactly what it was intended to do. It even got tested in the federal court and was found to be robust. And then and it was enacted, and it ended up saving hundreds of lives, hundreds of people who were evacuated. And of course, we've only just seen the last of those people released from places like the Park Hotel prison down in Melbourne just during this campaign, or just prior to this campaign starting. So that was a piece of legislation that we were able to formulate, to draft, to negotiate, and to put into place, and to get through the House of Representatives and the Senate by one vote. And it was, tremendously impactful because it shone a light on Australia's refugee policy. It solved the problem for that time, and it showed what could be achieved by having a strong, sensible crossbench with their hearts in the right place.
Yeah, I think it is an example and perhaps an inspiration for a lot of the people who feel that we currently feel like we're in kind of stuck mode politically. Even the campaign feels like it's just the same old bloody campaign again. And it's almost like it's doing that regardless of what the leaders are bringing to the table or the parties are bringing to the table. The press is all convinced it's all about gaffes and gotcha moments and how much is it going to cost? The same questions. They're in stuck mode. They just put the old record on, stick the needle on and ignore the scratches. And it's great to see your example and the other women we've mentioned before actually disrupting that. In fact, I can't help but make this possibly very bad joke, given your profession, but it seems the doctors' wives have rebelled. Indeed, some of them have become doctors.
Yes, we have women of all occupations around the country who are saying enough, and it's not just the women; it's the men around the country. I mean, the number,
a lot of men too.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that the support that I had from all genders and from people from across the spectrum who were just so happy to see another alternative and an opportunity to actually be involved in the political process. And many of this, in fact, almost all of the volunteers who threw on a purple T-shirt for me in 2018 had never volunteered in a political campaign ever in their lives. The most they'd ever done was to turn up on polling day and register their vote. And these people, they'd never donated, they'd never volunteered, they didn't know what a flyer was, they didn't know what a call flute was. They rolled up and said, tell me what I can do to help. And that's what we're seeing in these community campaigns all around the country, people rolling up their sleeves saying, this excites me. It's the first time I've been excited about something political in my life, and I want to get involved.
That's exactly how it feels. I think you're absolutely right too. I think there's a sense, I certainly have this sense, it's one of the things that led me to stand, that our democracy is in peril, that it's not as healthy as it should be. It's not as robust as it should be, and it's being used and misused by groups in the community for their own ends, really. And therefore, watching people get out and get active, put the coloured T-shirts on. You know, I'm in North Sydney, it's Kylie Tink pink everywhere. You know, whatever it is, and getting active is a really good way of saying, I'm not going to let my democracy die of neglect or wither on the vine because of neglect. People are getting up and getting active, and I think that's so exciting. So I'm with you 100% there, and we're finding very much the same thing. But I do want to move to an issue that you've, you know, rightly been very vocal about, and that's COVID. You know, that thing we've forgotten? We decided, oh, it's all over, you know, nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. I believe in New South Wales today, a whole lot of restrictions were taken off. I thought to myself, they'll be putting them back on again soon, I'm sure. You know, you've been very critical of the management of COVID. I've watched and retweeted many of your comments about them because they seem very sensible to me. How are you feeling right now? What's your take on how this pandemic is being dealt with?
Well, I'm a member of a group called AusSage, which was started by Raina McIntyre and an epidemiologist, and it has dozens of experts across a whole range of fields who are lending their expertise as volunteers to look at the evidence all around the world for what works to try to control this pandemic. For anyone to say that this pandemic in Australia is anything like over is just ridiculous. We had in Australia today 378,000 active cases, currently today. In the last 24 hours, almost 39,000 new cases in Australia. We've had 5.2 million cases to date in Australia. And to lift safeguards, and people talk about restrictions, wearing a mask is not a restriction. It's a sign of respect for your fellow human being.
Absolutely.
And to lift and you know, the reality is that people can kind of intuitively know that wearing a mask is a good idea and it's protection for themselves. For those people who are community spirited, they understand that the mask is there to protect themselves and others as well from infection. And also bearing in mind that there isn't a single person under 5 years old in this country who's vaccinated.
No, I've got a 4-year-old granddaughter.
Yep. And we do not know the potential impact of a COVID infection on sending them off to daycare. We're sending them out into the community unvaccinated and unprotected. And to remove things like isolation and rely on rapid antigen testing when we know that it can take several days of somebody being infectious before the rapid antigen test becomes positive. And sometimes it's only when the PCR test is done that it's recognised. We are increasing the danger, particularly for people who are vulnerable. There are some people who can't be fully vaccinated for medical reasons. There are some people who, even vaccinated, will become very sick and die from this illness. There are people, regardless of being vaccinated, who will develop long COVID, and there are children who are unprotected. In that kind of situation where there are almost 400,000 active cases currently in Australia, I don't understand the rationale, the public health rationale behind removing safeguards without putting other safeguards in place, like mask wearing. You know, and people will be guided by government. Even if the government is not following public health advice, people will be guided by government advice, right? And if they're being told you don't have to wear a mask anymore, it's like, you beauty, we don't have to wear a mask anymore. Other people who really think about it and look at the situation and think about it rationally are saying, you know what, I think it's reasonable to keep on wearing the mask, to isolate if I think I might be infective, you know, to just be that little bit more careful. But it's not just about vaccines. And it's not just about masks. We also need to be thinking about things like ventilation, like opening windows and doors, about air quality, about gathering in numbers, about rapid antigen testing, people who are coming into a group environment, for example. What are we doing about getting reliable data on things like tracking and tracing? So I think, that we have to, I think, after this next election, I don't think we're going to get a lot of sense until after the election, but we have to, I think, really take another look at how Australia is handling the pandemic and where we're tracking. And I think that, we also need to recognise that as new variants emerge and as the situation changes, ebbs and flows from time to time, there will be safeguards that will have to be put back in place. There might be new safeguards that have to be put into place, and simple things like wearing a mask on public transport. That's not a restriction on anybody. That allows other people greater freedom.
Yeah, I don't understand the fury about masks, and I dislike intensely how sensible protective measures, which are as much as you say about, considering other people and their vulnerabilities as looking after yourself, have been equated with a kind of anti-freedom, that there is somehow something free about being able to go around spraying your germs all over everybody, that's awesome, and something not free about taking the time to worry about how possibly an unknown infection you have could affect others. It feels political to me. It feels as if groups that are intent on an agenda I don't understand, and I'm not sure I'd want to understand, frankly, have hijacked the pandemic for their own purposes and have panicked a lot of people into rejecting the very things that will actually make us get through it faster.
Well, we were doing really well in the early part of the pandemic, and then the political tide shifted around about July of 2021, and there was what was generally referred to as a hashtag "Let It Rip" approach, where it was like, "Hey, most of you are vaccinated, let's let it rip," and most of the safeguards at that point were removed, and then again in December of last year in New South Wales, the safeguards were all removed and said, go off and have a lovely Christmas holidays and don't worry about anything. And of course, a week later, some of those safeguards had to be restored because the numbers took off so quickly.
And that's how our Premier got the lovely name Domicron.
It is. Look, it's a serious business. There are very vulnerable people who are living very like a shadow lockdown, because they have to be very, very careful about where they go out, how they go out. Couldn't dream of going to a restaurant or a theatre, or people who are very medically vulnerable, people maybe who are going through cancer treatment, who have immunosuppressed, can't be vaccinated, and it's life is really tough for those people. And I think we have to, when I talked earlier about not leaving anyone behind, these are the people we're leaving behind. And the other thing to consider is that, in terms of business, just getting enough people to be able to work who aren't sick, people who are not going to suffer from long COVID because they got the infection, even if whether or not they were vaccinated. It does reduce the risk of long COVID if you are vaccinated, but it doesn't eliminate the risk. And then we saw the impact on the supply chain when so many people were unwell that we didn't have the people to deliver the goods and the produce to all of us who need things like food.
Yeah, well, we're seeing it, the consequences in schools too, yes, where classes are having to be collapsed. There's no real teaching going on because the staff and many students are getting sick on a regular basis. But it's as if we've just turned our collective faces away from that, as if we're just going, oh no, it'll all be fine. Let's just carry on as normal. It feels a bit like our attitude towards climate change. It's as if we look at these very difficult problems, and instead of saying, okay, this is tough, how do we face up to it realistically and maturely, we say, well, this is tough, let's pretend it's not happening.
Well, look, I started looking at climate change as a human health issue back in 2000 when I was AMA president. So that's 22 years ago. And when we came up at that time with the first ever AMA policy position statement on climate change and human health. And we already then knew so much. And now 22 years later, we know so much more. And then we go off to COP26 in Glasgow and, we embarrass ourselves.
Oh, humiliation.
We've got Zali Steggall, who's come up with a fantastic climate change bill, doesn't even get debated because of the structure of our parliament. And then, of course, there's the Integrity Commission bill that Helen Haynes has widely consulted on and tried to get debated in Parliament, which can't get debated. And, I think, the whole process of representing what it is that's important to the Australian people seems to have been lost in this kind of two-party argy-bargy.
Yeah, because to me, it's quite shocking that a legitimately elected member of Parliament can be gagged over a bill that they're putting forward, which was one of the reasons that their electors elected them. Forget about who the person is or the party is. Surely that is our democratic government flouting the will of the people, literally doing the opposite of what it's supposed to do. Yes, they can debate the issue, that's the point, but to even stop it being debated, it also indicates to me that they have no argument. Anyone who wants to shut down debate usually knows they've got a shit point of view and nothing to back it up with, and they're going to lose that debate somewhat embarrassingly if they allow it to go ahead. Now, I'm aware that we've been talking and I've been asking you questions for half an hour, and I know from the chat that we've got lots of people in the audience with lots of questions they want to ask. So I'm going to hand over to Hannah to start asking those questions.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, let's have a look. I have about 3 screens going on here now because we're going out to so many different platforms with so many different chats. It's like I'm in Batman or something.
Rather you than me.
So we have a question from, and also don't forget everyone, if you would like to ask your own questions, now is the time to do it. Pop it in the Q&A or pop it into the chat or wherever you're watching. I'm keeping an eye on it. So Stephanie asks, is centrist, and that's in inverted commas because centrist can be a tricky word to define, on the part of independents going to be sufficient for progress on the very serious social determinants of ill health? And I think in this case, Stephanie kind of uses the definition of someone who may brand themselves socially progressive but economically conservative. And Steph says that may mean more punitive policy for the most vulnerable, wouldn't it? Does that really cut it?
It's certainly not been my experience, and I'm sure, Jane, you would also have been looking carefully at the policies of the other independent or small party candidates, and certainly from my discussions with the independent candidates in various parts of the country, they are very much determined to make sure that that they deliver outcomes that are better and that nobody is left behind.
I mean, I'm not sure what centrist means, because I guess we all think we're centrists because we see ourselves in the, we're, and everyone else is to either side of us. But I know what you mean. It is, and also I think to some extent, whilst I can be quite ideological at times, or idealistic perhaps rather than ideological, there is a sense in which you have to be prepared to accept the good, even if you can't get the great, because we are, this will be a negotiation. This is not going to be a prime minister who comes in as an independent. Whoever is on the crossbench is going to have to work with whoever ends up being the prime minister if they're going to get anything done. I would assume. Mind you, I'm looking from the outside. You were inside, Kerryn, so you know the answer to that question better than me.
Well, I developed very detailed policies as an independent, even though we didn't have a great deal of time to actually prepare ourselves. I brought in experts in a whole range of fields, took the temperature of the electorate, and worked out exactly what, the things that people really wanted to see brought to the Parliament on their behalf. And there were things like the Integrity Commission, like climate action, like action on refugee policy, live sheep exports was another big thing that came up during that time, aged care, childcare. healthcare, of course, mental health. So there are a whole range of issues. And so what I do suggest to somebody, to the person who asked the question, if you have an independent, a community-based independent in your electorate, jump onto their website, have a look at their policies, and that will tell you what they stand for.
Yep.
Wonderful. Let's see, we have a question here from Rachel saying, is there any chance that the next government, whoever that may be, will take an approach to COVID that's actually informed by the medical research, or are we too far gone down the let it rip path?
Well, I think it remains to be seen. There are many of my colleagues and I who are prepared to continue arguing for policies that safeguard public health. And the thing is that we don't know everything about COVID, but we know enough for me to be very, very cautious and to recommend that people do whatever they can not to catch it.
Yeah. Look, I would imagine that there is a point at which reality bites. The problem is, how bad do things have to get before reality bites? I worry with the climate that they have to get very bad indeed. And I think if this government manages to get itself re-elected, in a way we've said, okay, we can keep on raping and pillaging the land and being basically totally irresponsible about our impact on the warming planet for at least another 3 years. That's the problem. And the same with the pandemic. How bad is so bad that people will insist on our leaders taking action. And nobody knows. And that's the frightening thing about this election. Maybe Australia's had it so lucky for so long, we don't really understand how bad things can get. Don't want to be that gloomy, but I've wondered that before. Next question.
Jules asks, so much major party campaigning is targeted at families. What policies can help single people and people struggling with cost of living, housing affordability, and so forth?
Well, Jane, you're the candidate.
Well, absolutely. And it is one of the things that I feel very strongly about, particularly the terrible financial vulnerability of older women and single women in general. We know from, all the evidence and the research that it is single women who are most at risk of poverty as they get older. That means never married, widowed, or divorced. I think it's some phenomenal figure, and I'm plucking it out of my not all that fabulous memory, but it's something like about 3/4 of women over 60 or 65 who are living in private rental accommodation are at risk of becoming homeless and living in poverty because rents are going up, and $46 a day, or the pension, even the pension if they're on that, is not enough to keep up with rents despite the rental subsidy. So absolutely right. We ignore single people, both men and women, and concentrate on, we do it in a whole lot of ways. We seem to want to almost reduce Australia down to a country of tradies in high vis with 2 little children and a nice compliant wife who has a nice little job earning some pin money 3 days a week. We don't want to encourage her to go back any more than that. I mean, we want women to rise, but not at the expense of anyone else, remember? Everything seems to be directed at them. I presume this can only be because in what were considered the marginal seats, and we started this by saying we feel like we're in stuck mode in this election. What used to be the marginal seats, those were the people who you were most likely to be able to pull one way or the other. Very interesting whether that's still true. I don't know. What do you think, Kerryn?
You raised a lot of really important issues. And these issues also came up during the 2018 by-election as well. And I looked very carefully into things like the vulnerability. And of course, I was on City of Sydney Council for over 5 years as well, and looking at issues like affordable housing and social housing, and how we could provide that sort of basic fundamental human right for individuals of a safe roof over their heads. And of course, I think we need structural reform in a whole range of areas, and one of those, of course, is superannuation reform when it comes to women, because women are very much disadvantaged when it comes to retirement age. Women who are single or who are divorced can quite often find themselves at a serious disadvantage financially. And of course, it can be very difficult for older women to find employment, or older people to find suitable employment that utilises their life experience and their substantial skills. And age can be a barrier there as well. So, there are those issues. There are also for women, there are the childcare issues, childcare affordability. And of course, we need to see that, and the issues for people right across the spectrum, but particularly people who are trying to raise children and have suitable accommodation for them, and then sort of the issues around aged care. I mean, right the way through the life cycle, we need to be looking at structural reforms that will make sure that we look after people who are vulnerable, and that we make sure that the government does the job of government in supporting those who need to be supported.
Well, in the end, most women end up single because we live longer than men. So the point about being not a family, being single, is a particular issue, I think, for women a lot of the time, particularly as they get older, but it's hard for young women too. It's I read a horrible headline today which said young people have given up on the idea of ever owning a home. That's just, we need structural reform, as you say, and we need public housing, old-fashioned, bloody public housing. It worked once, let's do it again.
So there was a bit of talk before about the tactics or the people that independents are trying to target, and how that sort of tends to be shifting this election. We have a question from B on Instagram, who asks, how are independent candidates reaching out to voters who have turned off to party politics? A lot of debate passes these people by because they're no longer listening. How do you reach them?
They're being reached, Hannah. They're being reached. If you've looked at the social media feeds of the launches of people like Allegra Spender, Zoe Daniel, Monique Ryan, Sophie Scomps, Kylie Tink, all around the country, these incredible pictures, photos, messages from people who are, as they did in my 2018 by-election campaign, rolling up their sleeves, putting on a T-shirt and getting out there and getting involved. There is an excitement out there. People, I think, can sense change in the breeze, and they want to be part of it.
I think that's true. And also, one piece of really good news yesterday was something like, and this is my memory with the figure, something like 241 or 251,000 people enrolled to vote, I think, yesterday, which is a record. They've never had that many people enrolled to vote. And then it was the deadline, I think, yesterday that you had to get your enrolment in. That's fantastic. That will be a lot of younger people, of course, but also people who've previously been disengaged, perhaps from politics, and avoided enrolling. So I think there is much more engagement amongst a lot of people in this election than I've seen for a really long time. But we do have to break down that apathy, because somebody's got a saying, and I'm going to get it wrong, but it's something along the lines of, if you don't do politics, politics will do you. So you have to get engaged and involved, or you'll end up wondering why the hell everything's going to hell, which is perhaps what most of Australia is doing right now, and getting worried about it.
Well, it's interesting, Jane, because you talked earlier about a lot of the independent candidates disrupting the system. These independent candidates are disrupting their lives.
Yeah.
for the greater good. They are saying, you know, we've got doctors, we've got business people, we've got journalists, we've got lawyers, we've got people, you know, academics, we've got people with this incredible professional expertise and experience in great jobs who are saying, I want to get in there and help to fix the system.
Yeah.
And they are disrupting their own lives. They are not, their primary motivation is not to, you know, disrupt. Their primary motivation is to actually fix, to heal, to sort out the problems that they see, that they perceive.
But the break down that terrible stuck, going round and round in circles. And what is it? The definition of insanity? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. It's like sanity is beginning to prevail again because people are saying we can't keep doing this the same way anymore because we're not getting any results at all.
Do we have time for one or two more questions?
Sure.
All right.
You're all right, Kerryn?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Great questions, by the way.
They are wonderful. And Sarah, who is also in the Instagram chat, Sarah actually has a problem, but it's a good problem to have. Sarah says, we have 2 decent women contenders running as independents in my seat of Flinders, which was Greg Hunt's seat. I want to vote the coalition out. How do I make my vote count? Who do I choose?
You want me to handle that one, Jane?
Yeah, go on, Kerryn.
What you need to do is to look at the policies of, Despi O'Connor is one of the local mayors down there who's running. And what you need to do is to look at the policies of each of the independent candidates. If necessary, see if you can, you know, make a time to drop into their campaign office and meet them, or find a place where they're doing a meet and greet in the street and have a chat. And see which person best reflects your views. What you can then do is you put a 1 against the name of the candidate that you prefer, and then you can put a 2 against the next candidate. And if one of those 2 is in a winning position, then the preferences will flow to the candidate of your choice and so you can also make sure that you educate yourself about the impact of your preferences. So in the Wentworth by-election, there were 16 candidates. And so, you know, a lot depended on which way the preferences flowed as to who was eventually going to get the highest number of preferential voting. So, you know, if there are 2 good independents, that's good news. Vote for the one that you like the best.
And put the other 1
against the one you like second best.
Exactly. And then they'll both benefit from that vote. Same in the Senate. Above the line, you have to vote 1 to 6. And one of the reasons that I decided to stand, there were a whole lot, but one of them was because I was aware that there was now more choice in many seats in the House of Reps as to who you could put your vote against. But in the Senate, I thought people need choices there too, and they need to be able to go 1 to 6, all progressive if that's what they want to vote, not have to put 6. You're tossing up between the UAP, the FON, or the LNP, and you actually want to put all of them right down the arse end. So have a think about it in the Senate, because the thing about the Senate vote is it's a quota system, so votes get exhausted. So it really is quite important in the Senate to vote 1 to 6 above the line. If you're going to vote below the line, which 97% of Australians don't do, you can go 1 to 12, but above the line, 1 to 6. And it's really important to go the full 6 because you want one of those people to get in, because if one of those people get in, they block someone who may be very reactionary getting in if you want to see a more progressive Senate. It's a very good question to ask. A lot of people don't understand the mechanics of how our voting system works. Don't just vote 1. Your vote will run out.
Absolutely. There is a question here from Carolyn, and this is a great question. How hard is it to negotiate as an independent with the major parties? Do you have to partake in some horse trading, or how does it work?
Depends what you're negotiating. I think it's, any kind of negotiation, what you have to do is to find common ground. And so I think it remains to be seen what negotiations happen between the various crossbenchers and whichever major party gets the most votes at the next after the next election. So that landscape as yet is unforeseen. But in terms of negotiating on particular legislation, and if there is a hung parliament, as there has been in the past, then each piece of legislation can be negotiated, which ultimately, hopefully, will lead to better outcomes. So, for example, a piece of legislation might be put up, lock, stock and barrel by a major party that has the majority. But if you've got a crossbench of independents, that they can, if they collectively, individually and collectively, have improvements that they would like to make to the legislation, then they can negotiate those improvements. So it all depends on what comes down to the numbers after the results come in, whether there's going to be any negotiation at all. And I think we're in a better situation if there is the ability to negotiate outcomes.
I know. I suppose the upside there is that if the ability to negotiate is not present there in the lower house, because whoever forms government forms a majority, the Senate very rarely has a government majority, doesn't it? Yeah. So if someone like Jane is in the Senate on the crossbench, then that will make the Senate a very powerful and important place to make those changes. Right.
It's very important that we have good people in the Senate.
We are doing pretty well. Look, I might just finish you both off with one final question. Denise says, any expectations for the leaders' debate tonight? And Melanie adds to that, how is it that it's on Sky News? What are your thoughts? Any predictions?
I just can't. It's on Sky. I never turn Sky on. I just can't. And again, it feels like it's going to be stuck mode. I hope it isn't. I hope it does something different.
But I have a somewhat different view, Jane. I spoke to pretty much every media outlet, including Sky and the Murdoch press and whatever, because I think if you need to be able to reach, particularly as if you are an MP or a candidate, I think you need to be able to reach as many potential constituents as possible, and people will either like what you have to say or not like what you have to say, but they need to hear it.
That's a good point. But I used to appear regularly on Sunrise, which I was very happy to do.
Yep.
But I just find, particularly Sky After Dark, I just don't think that the people who watch that, I've got only so much energy. I'm going to go where
there are some limits.
I'm going to go where I think there are votes for me, and I'm not going to go where I think there aren't votes for me, because I think that's the other thing we have to remember. You are quite right about people standing, disrupting their lives, which you obviously did yourself. And candidates need to have some self-care and make sure you put your energy where you think it's going to get the most result, because otherwise you can exhaust yourself and not gain very much at all. And I'm not sure that's a good idea, particularly as candidates are running out and about, and we can't keep our masks on as much as others can. So there's always the ever-present threat of getting COVID. So it's a really interesting time to be a candidate. But yes, look, I agree with you in principle. Go and talk to whoever you can. And it's not as if you're an independent candidate, you are getting necessarily the same offers to be able to speak to mainstream media as the mainstream parties are, which is another instance, I think, of the mainstream media, and the way the political classes run its kind of cycle in Australia is in stuck mode. It's still doing the same things it's always done. But the public isn't. And that's why this election is going to be really interesting.
It certainly is, Jane. I wish you all the best and every success, and thank you for being prepared to disrupt your life and to stand up for what you believe in.
Well, right back at you, Kerryn, because I think without your example and success, I'm not sure that the independent movement would be as buoyant and as disruptive as it currently is. So thank you for doing it and showing us all that it's possible. We can have a go.
Thank you, Jane.
That might wrap us up then for the evening. Professor Kerryn Phelps, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Your insight to the importance of independence has just been absolutely fascinating. We do hope we get the chance to have a chat to you again sometime.
Absolutely. I'll be ringing you, I am sure, Kerryn, through the course of the next few weeks.
Put me
if
on
only for
speed
therapy.
Put me on speed dial, Jane.
I will.
And thank you, of course, to everyone who joined us tonight. Thank you for everyone who asked questions, and thank you to everyone out there on social media who have joined us. If you would like to get involved to help get Jane and Reason into the Senate, I have popped some links into the Zoom chat. You can go and visit the website. You can find out how to volunteer. You can find out how to donate. And of course, you can always keep up to date with the campaign by following Jane and Reason and myself and all of the campaign accounts on all of the regular social medias as well. And on that final note, I think we might say goodbye. Thank you so much again, Kerryn, and thank you, as always, Jane. We'll see you next time.
And thank you, Hannah. Awesome job as usual.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Bye.